The Carson City Historical Society is proud to present its second lecture of 2021, The Cocktail and Alcohol Culture of Virginia City. Garrett Barmore is here to discuss the history of several alcoholic beverages and how they relate to daily life in Virginia City during the mining boom. He has provided 3 cocktail recipes and a bonus punch recipe, which, if you haven't received them, can be downloaded from the Society's website at cchistorical.org. Garrett Barmore is curator of the W.M. Keck Earth Science and Mineral Engineering Museum at the University of Nevada, Reno. He received his master's degree in museology from the University of Washington and specializes in professionalizing small museums. Garrett is very interested in Nevada mining history and has worked as a historical archaeologist in Nevada. He is past president of the Nevada Museums Association. I encourage you to see his entertaining explorations of the earth sciences on his Mineral Monday video series on the unr.edu website. Just search in Google or in vimeo.com for Mineral Monday to discover episodes. Garrett, why don't we go ahead and why don't you start your presentation?
Sounds good. Thank you, David. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint so that you're not just staring at me for an hour. And before I get started, I just would like to give a short land acknowledgement. When talking about Virginia City, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that Virginia City and most of the Reno, Virginia City, Carson City area is part of the Washoe tribe and traditionally belonged to the Washoe tribe. And Virginia City and mining was very detrimental, and you can even use the term disastrous to that culture and the other cultures of Nevada. And so it's a very important thing to keep in mind when talking about this history. Now, moving into the actual presentation, someone's requesting remote control of my screen. I'm going to decline. I like to say that the research that went into this is still very much ongoing. I actually worked on this for this presentation. David and I were talking about how this would be an interesting topic. So kind of went down a rabbit hole, and there's a lot here. And so one of the sources that I used to kind of think about what a 19th century cocktail would be is Jerry Thomas's 1862 book, How to Mix Drinks, or the Bon Vivant's Guide, which is a fantastic name. And these drinks aren't necessarily, if there's a drink in the book, it doesn't necessarily say it was in Virginia City, but there was a cocktail culture in the United States, possibly as early as the 1830s. And cocktails are considered uniquely American. And of course, we all know some of the first well-known cocktails of the 1850s came out of New Orleans, the Sazerac, and the Brandy Crusta, which it may not be as well known. But by the 1870s, which we'll talk more about, cocktail culture had reached Virginia City. And there are newspaper accounts saying that saloons could rival anything you could find on Broadway in New York. So with very little ado, we're going to start with our first drink. I'll talk a little bit about more exactly what the gin fix is and what ingredients and why I chose certain ingredients as we move on a little bit further. But because this is a new talk, and I'm still not too sure about it, I want you guys to have some liquor in you before we continue. So this first drink, as you can see on the left, that is the original recipe from the 1862 guide. And it does take a little bit to really decipher it. So on the right is the recipe that I modernized. And when you look, it says a wine glass of water. In the 1860s, at this time, a wine glass would have been about 4 ounces. There's a really interesting study about how wine glasses have increased size over time, depending on how available wine is. As wine became cheaper, wine glasses became larger. And so I kind of use the 4-ounce idea of when I built my more modern recipe. The DO took me forever to figure this out. That most likely is abbreviation for ditto. So this shows up a lot in the book. And so most likely is another wine glass, 1 wine glass of gin. So for this recipe, this is going to be a mixed drink. So I use my mixing glass, but you can pretty much use any vessel that works. And so go ahead and put your ice into your mixing glass or whatever you are using. I generally use about 3 ice cubes to kind of get things going. And I also want to say I have never worked as a bartender. I am not a mixologist. So any mistakes in mixology are purely my own. And I do know there are some bartenders in the audience. And take your Gordon's gin, and we'll talk about why we use Gordon's gin. So 2 ounces of Gordon's gin. And if you don't have one of these measure and pours, they are fantastic. I use it all the time. About 1 ounce of water. And this is a fairly light drink and pretty straightforward. Then a 1/4 ounce of lemon juice. If you like it to be a little sharper, you can put in a little bit more. And then your sugar. 1 teaspoon of sugar. And that's quite a bit of sugar when you think about it. So I just kind of eyeball it. And take your spoon and mix it until the sugar dissolves or nearly dissolves. You get this kind of almost a lemonade color to it. In many ways, this is just a boozy lemonade, which what's wrong with that? Then take your strainer, and you can pretty much use anything to strain if you don't have a strainer, and pour it into your glass. And as a quick aside, this is one of my favorite glasses, this coupe glass. This is my great grandmother's glass, and she acquired in the Great Depression by sending in box tops from soap, and then garnish with your lemon round, and you have your gin fix. Now, a fix was a type of cocktail that showed up a lot in the 19th century. So you could do a brandy fix, a whiskey fix. And if you know a little bit about cocktails or cocktail culture, you can see how a fix like this is kind of the beginning of a lot of different kinds of cocktails. Okay. Any questions so far about the fix? So I just like to start very quickly with a quick primer on Virginia City. I'm assuming most of you have a very basic understanding of the history. But as you know, gold was first discovered by Mormon settlers on their way to California about 1850. But they thought that the real diggings, the real exciting work was in California. So they left the area, what would become Dayton, and kind of Gold Canyon as it would become known, and they moved on. By 1851, Dayton was founded and many permanent miners had moved in. And it was a really rough and tumble life, all up and down what would become known as the Comstock in 1851. There were about between 1852 and 1855, over 100 men working in the Gold Canyon area. And by 1859, it had been kind of considered played out. And a lot of miners had moved on. And very famously, the Comstock lode was, of course, discovered in 1859. And they realized they had something. So they began to dig, to go down, mostly mining for gold. And they came across what they called the damned blue stuff, or the blue mud. And this was a nuisance to the miners. They hated it. They threw it away. They threw it in potholes. Until a couple people had the wherewithal to get it tested. What was this stuff? And it came back as being almost pure silver. The sample was worth almost $3,800 per ton in 1859, $1860. So very quickly, Virginia City became a silver camp. And of course, according to legend, and this story is most likely apocryphal, but I do enjoy telling it, Virginia City may owe its name to alcohol. The story goes that Old Virginia, one of the more famous and well-known and beloved prospectors through that in that area at that time, was walking along what would become C Street, and he tripped and spilled his whiskey. And he decided to christen the new mining camp Virginia City so that his whiskey wouldn't go to waste. Now there's no way of knowing whether or not that happened, but Virginia City was named after Old Virginia to honor him. In the 1860s, Virginia City was still very much a frontier town. One of the first buildings in Virginia City was a saloon. It was a tent building, but throughout the 1860s, it boomed and busted, and many people moved in and many people left. By the end of the 1860s, it very much was decided that this was going to be a permanent camp. And it is worth noting that Virginia City was one of the first industrial underground mining operations in the West. Now, the main area that we're focusing on for this talk is the 1870s. The 1870s is when Virginia City came into its own. And this is when Virginia City was a cosmopolitan, industrial, populous city that competed with San Francisco and St. Louis, and even through comparisons to New York City itself. Many things happened that allowed Virginia City to really prosper in the 1870s. First, the Virginia and Truckee Railroad was completed, which meant that there was a direct line from Virginia City to the Central Pacific Railroad, which connected it to the rest of the country. So you could suddenly get anything in Virginia City. Two, the Virginia and Gold Hill Water Company completed their flume from the Sierras to Virginia City, which gave Virginia City running water. And that changes everything, especially when cocktails are concerned. It really helps to have ice and water. And then finally, in 1874, the Consolidated Virginia Mine struck the big bonanza, which was one of the largest silver deposits in history. And so suddenly, there was an influx of accessibility, resources, and money. And Virginia City took off. It was not the Wild West of imagination. At its height, it had a population of well over 25,000 people. The average miner made the modern equivalent of about $2,300, $2,400 a month, and was able to find room and board for about $500 or $600 a month in modern money. And so without a lot of bills and a lot of overhead, there was a lot of miners, a lot of people that were flush, that had a lot of money. And things were expensive in Virginia City, which we'll talk a little bit about. During this time, it was not uncommon for a miner to have steak for breakfast. And some common fare throughout the city was steak, roast beef, oysters, fish and game, fresh trout from the Truckee and Lake Tahoe, sage hens, duck, grouse, and other games, fruits and vegetables. There were bakeries throughout the city. Dairies were also common, but dairies possibly were a spread disease. And miners' families lived relatively well, but simply in small 1 or 2 room houses. But unmarried miners would live above restaurants and saloons. And once again, their food and drink was included in their rent. Maybe not drink so much, but their food definitely was. This is from Elliot Lord's book, Mines and Miners of the Comstock, which was originally published in 1884. Even though the frontispiece says 1883. And it's a little hard to read, but this is a common items as of 1880 in their prices. And so you can see oysters and jams and jellies and apricots. And our next cocktail involves pineapple, which is still kind of an exotic fruit. And imagine the 1870s in Virginia City being able to get access to pineapple. But when you look closely on the right towards the bottom, we have what we're here for. So we have whiskey, brandy, gin, port wine. And whiskey costs between, I believe that says $3 and $5 a gallon. And this was a time when $1 was the equivalent to $25. So, so things were a lot more expensive, but people had money to spend. So let's go back to the gin fix. The gin fix tonight is the only cocktail on our list that was not actively mentioned in the subject material. So why did I choose the gin fix? One, it was in the book, so we knew that gin fixes were a thing by the 1870s. And two, there was an amazing archaeological dig that happened in the early 2000s of the Boston Saloon and several other saloons throughout Virginia City, including the old corner bar at Piper's Opera House. And the archaeological evidence that came out of these saloons was amazing. And this work was done by Kelly Dixon, Dr. Kelly Dixon, who is now at the University of Montana. And her thesis is online and is easily found through the UNR website, and I suggest you check it out. Now, why nobody mentioned the gin fix, we found archaeological evidence, broken bottles of Gordon's dry London gin. So we found a Gordon's bottle, and it was rectangular, and actually very similar to this one even. So we know they had Gordon's gin. Also, we know they have water, and we know that they had lemons and sugar. And so therefore, somebody should have mixed those things together at some point. And it's very believable. I'm not sure if likely is the right word, but it's very believable that they were drinking gin fixes on the Comstock or something similar. Now, if you want a good variation of the gin fix, is replace your still water with seltzer water or mineral water. And I like to call that the Virginia City gin fix, because another thing that they found in abundance was seltzer and mineral water bottles, particularly mineral water from the Nassau region of Germany. And those were particularly prominent in the old corner bar at Piper's Opera House, because Piper himself was of German descent. And there's some really interesting German artifacts that were found, including a Marchand pipe. But the real star of Virginia City archaeology is, of course, the Boston Saloon. And the Boston Saloon was on D Street, just off of Union, and it was an African-American bar. And some amazing things came out of the Boston Saloon, including seltzer and mineral water bottles. But on the left, that little green bottle is a Worcestershire sauce bottle. So, and many sauces were found. And so they had some sort of meal plan. They were serving food. There was evidence of butchered bones. Most famously, a Tabasco bottle was found at this site, the world's oldest Tabasco bottle. And some other amazing pieces, such as a pipe stem that they were able to do some DNA testing on, and found female DNA. So it showed that there was women and women smoking in the bar. They also found a trombone mouthpiece, so which kind of breaks up the idea of the type of music that would have been at a saloon at that time. And so this work really blew open the idea of what a saloon was in the American West. Now, I hope that you drank down your first drink very quickly, because we're on to the second drink, the Pisco Punch. Now, I knocked over my shaker in the last demonstration. You probably heard that. So let me just grab that real quick and I'll be right back. So the Pisco Punch might be a bit surprising if you know the Pisco Punch, because it is a very famous San Francisco drink. San Francisco is known for the Pisco Punch, and it was invented in San Francisco. It's most often credited to Duncan Nicol, who was the keeper of the Bank Exchange Saloon. And the Bank Exchange Saloon is now where the pyramid is in San Francisco. It was on that site. It was close to where the stock market was in San Francisco, which was a major, a very important part of Virginia City history, that stock exchange. And also, there's a good chance that it was on the same street or around the block of O'Brien's saloon. And O'Brien was, of course, famously the one of the partners of the Big Four with Virginia City and the Bonanza firm with John Mackey. And the label on the left, I just really like. That's from the 1930s. And that you can find that at the California Historical Society. But what is a Pisco Punch? And you may be looking at the ingredients and they may seem kind of strange to you. So first, what is Pisco? So Pisco is a great brandy from Peru. And one of the reasons why they were drinking Pisco in San Francisco is because it was cheaper to get brandy from Peru than whiskey from the East Coast. And the pineapple gum syrup. So of course it's a pineapple flavoring, but the gum syrup shows up a lot in the How to Mix Drinks books. It was very common in the 19th century in making cocktails. And it's essentially a simple syrup or a sugar syrup mixed with Arabic gum. And it acts as an emulsifier, which gives a cocktail a really smooth consistency and mouthfeel. Now, why did I choose the Pisco Punch? Well, there was a very famous saloon in Virginia City called the Sazerac Club. And I'll get to that. And the Sazerac Club was mentioned by Mark Twain, very famously. The owner of the Sazerac Club shot a man, which Mark Twain talks about in Roughing It, and that upped the reputation of the saloon. And it was considered one of the higher, swankier saloons in Virginia City. And I have found no evidence that they actually served Sazeracs, the famous New Orleans drink. But there is some evidence they served Pisco Punch, and it would make sense that this cocktail, which was invented in the 1850s in San Francisco, would make its way up to Virginia City, considering how closely the two cities were connected and how often the upper class of Virginia City traveled back and forth from San Francisco. Sazerac, of course, is the name of a brandy. And so it's possible that they just named the bar after the brandy, but I don't know. There was also the Sazerac Liars Club in Austin, Nevada. So it was a common saloon name, or relatively common. If you want to make a true Sazerac, as it would have been made in the 19th century, then use brandy instead of rye. So they switched to rye in the 1860s, 70s because there was a grape blight in France and they were unable to get Sazerac brandy. Now to the cocktail itself. So once again, take your shaker, your cocktail shaker, your standard Boston shaker. It is much maligned these days, but I still use it. I still like it. And put in your 3 ice cubes. Okay. Then put in your 2 ounces of Pisco. Your 3/4 ounce of fresh lemon juice. And your 3/4 ounce of the pineapple gum syrup. And believe it or not, I was able just to get this at Total Wine. It's actually much more common than plain gum syrup, and that's why I decided to go with the more modern recipe as opposed to pineapple juice and plain gum syrup, so that you guys had a chance to get the correct. Now, this step is really important. You want to shake it, and you want to shake it really well for at least 15 seconds, or pretty much as long as you can. And the reason is to really get that pineapple gum emulsified. So really go for it. Use 2 hands if you really need to. Okay, I don't know if that was 15 seconds or not. I bet somebody was timing me, but we're going to go ahead and call it. You get that really nice condensation. That's how you know that it's chilled. Once again, use your strainer. This one is particularly important because you don't want a whole bunch of chips of ice. You're going to get this really creamy cocktail. It has kind of a fun, funky taste. The future founder of the New Yorker once said a Pisco punch has a kick, or goes down like lemonade, but has a kick like vodka. So, and there's some really fun warnings about the potency of some of these cocktails, which I'll talk a little bit more about when I get to the cold whiskey punch. Okay, so, but it is unrealistic to think that all Virginia Cityites were sitting up on the Comstock drinking cocktails. There is a lot of other drinks and alcohols going on. So whiskey, of course, was the crown jewel of Virginia City. There are accounts of there being famine and wagons arriving only carrying whiskey. And that was considered more important than food. And there was a lot of moonshine and homemade brandy. There's a fantastic story about an early kind of moonshine whiskey that was drank on the Comstock called tarantula juice. That was considered so potent that if a tarantula bit you, the tarantula would die. And of course, beer was very popular in Virginia City. If you look at the image on the left, what that is an IRS tax agent's book recording all of the barrels of beer that were produced at different breweries in the year 1880. And by just this book, there were at least 7 breweries in operation on the Comstocks, that's Silver City, Gold Hill, Virginia City, and they produced nearly 9,000 barrels of beer in 1880 alone, just by my quick addition of all 7 breweries. And on the right, this is once again archaeological evidence. I believe these might be from the Old Corner Bar, but these show up throughout all the saloon sites, and these are spigots. And these spigots could have been used for beer, they could have been used for whiskey, they could have been used for many different things. And so you would have your spigot, a barrel would arrive, and you would tap it. And another great account about the quality of some of the homemade alcohol available on the Comstock is actually from Mark Twain. He wrote in the Alameda County Gazette on June 23rd, 1860, in regards to a man who had just taken a drink of a brandy called Territorial Destruction. And he said, and I quote, "He first turned white, then red, then round and round, and finally horizontal. He recovered, however, and described the internal sensation as that of a stomach full of galvanic batteries, yellow hornets, pepper sauce, and vitriol." And I wonder if this was the same Territorial Destruction as the brandy that was served by a small like stage stop or inn that was by Devil's Gate, that was rumored to be able to kill a man at 20 paces. So there was a lot being drunk on the Comstock. We'll talk a little bit about some of the softer drinks in just a moment. But I also wonder, because there's very few accounts about actual cocktails on the Comstock, but there's very little accounts about what they were actually drinking. Saloons would advertise liquors, but they wouldn't advertise what they did with the liquors. And I'm wondering if, and this is purely conjecture, this is my own thought, if the idea of cocktails and different cocktails hadn't quite trickled down to the general public. And so they would go into a bar and order a whiskey drink or order a whiskey cocktail, because the term cocktail was in the vernacular, according to Alf Doughton in his diaries, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And the bartender would pour them something, and they didn't necessarily know what it was called. That's something I need to do a little bit more research about. But it would be really nice if I could find a broadside that said we're known for our Pisco punches, or we're known for our gin fixes. But that's just something I haven't been able to come across. Even after finding objects like this. This is at the Special Collections Archives. We don't know exactly which saloon this belonged to, because they actually didn't put the saloon's name in the book. But this is actually from Carson City, a saloon in Carson City. This is the cash book from 1863 to 1864 of the ins and outs and the expenses of the saloon. And there is detail about eggs and bread and beef, but when it comes to alcohol, it just says liquor freight, and then only tabs. So if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see a very faint name with an X next to it. That's Abe Curry. I'm assuming that's A. Curry. And he had a tab of $10. And from my time with this book, I'm not sure if A. Curry ever paid off his tab, but I'd have to look a little bit closer. But it's interesting, and I'm also wondering if this had to do with 19th century culture about trying to kind of keep quiet the goings-ons of a saloon. I mean, it would be really nice if they listed how many cocktails or how many drinks or how many even pints of beer they sold, but we just don't see that, at least in the existing material that I was able to come across. So we're to our third and final cocktail, the hot toddy. And we have a little bit more to talk about, but we'll go ahead and go through the making of the hot toddy. So you have something hot, kind of a dessert. I know this is all very quick, but the first two cocktails keep. So you can stick those in the refrigerator. You'll have a moment to do that and come back to them later in the night. So first, you want your mug and some sort of strainer. Don't put the strainer in the mug quite yet. First, you're going to put in your 1.5 ounces of bourbon whiskey. Well, 1.5 ounces of bourbon whiskey. Right into the cup. Then add your honey and your lemon. And put in your honey to taste. I like the taste of honey in a cocktail, so I put in quite a bit. If you can't quite get it off your spoon or whatever, you can actually leave it in there as you pour your hot water over it, and it'll melt the honey right off. And then your lemon. And this is the fun part. You can use loose leaf tea or a bag, stick it in your strainer, take your hot water, which I prepared beforehand, and just pour that over, and just kind of go ahead and fill that up. If you want a stronger tea taste, then go ahead and put your bag in. Otherwise, you're just kind of trying to get that tea essence. Then get your honey off your spoon. And then the real trick is to then stir it with a cinnamon stick. Stir that until your honey's dissolved. You can see on the left the brandy and whiskey toddy recipes in the book, which are fine, but I'm very partial to my wife's. So this is actually my wife's recipe that she developed over time. Okay, and you can leave the cinnamon in or you can remove the cinnamon and you have a nice cup of hot toddy. Now, like I said, the hot toddy was mentioned in the literature. And I'm going to read a passage from the diary of Alf Doughton. And Alf Doughton, if you don't know, he was a journalist. He worked for the Territorial Enterprise, and he worked up in Virginia City through the 1860s, 70s, and a little into the 1880s, I believe. And he wrote a daily journal, which is an amazing resource for historians. And it's actually available online and it's searchable. So that made my life very easy. So on November 19th, 1885, Alf wrote, same, snowed some more in the morning and rained some. PM, the clouds broke about 4 o'clock, but a sort of hazy fog set in, which obscured the sun and also the moon in the evening and night. Thaw, rivers and canyons and gulches all running full, plenty of water for all the mills everywhere. Streets very slushy, no very good sleighing. GH bus on wheels again. Home at 2, good fire, comfortably, hot toddy, warm feet, hot jug of water in bed, asleep at 3. So as Alf so eloquently put it, hot toddies are a great, amazing drink to have after a rainy, wet day, especially when you get right home and you're trying to relax. But also, Alf mentions hot toddies several times in his diaries, and they all are kind of used in this way in almost a medicinal sense. And I know in my family, hot toddies have been used for sore throats or other things like that. But there is a really interesting connection between medicine and alcohol, especially in the 19th century. Once again, going back to the Boston Saloon, several things were found at the Boston Saloon that implied there was some sort of medicinal presence. A syringe plunger was found, and there are several uses for a syringe plunger. But also, this bottle here is a bottle of Jamaica ginger extract. And so this was both used as a medicine and medicinal properties, a cure for nausea and other diseases, but there were also accounts of it being mixed with the before mentioned seltzer or even a light pale ale to make ginger ale or ginger beer. And several medicinal type bottles were found throughout these archaeological sites, including bitters and bitters bottles, which would have been used for digestion. Also, Dr. Dixon lays out in her work that there are accounts of dry patrons or members of the temperance movement drinking bitters to signal that they are dry, which is really interesting because bitters are alcoholic, but they weren't perceived as alcoholic. They were perceived as medicinal. Also, there were some bottles that were embossed with A.M. Cole, who was a druggist and an apothecariist in Virginia City. So there is a strange connection of medicine and alcohol, or saloons at least being a center or a place where there would be some medicinal remedies. They could have been for hangovers, or they could have also have just been a good location. And a lot of alcohols, a lot of liqueurs, such as vermouth and bitters, started their lives as medicinal. One of the most famous bitters, Peychaud's, which of course is used in the famous Sazerac. Peychaud was a druggist that was down the road from the bar that created the Sazerac. So there is an interesting connection. So these are some of my sources that I used, and I am indebted to Dr. Kelly Dixon. She has done some amazing work. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff out there. Now, before we go into questions, we have a bonus recipe. So this bonus recipe, I am not going to demo for you because it has to rest overnight and it serves 15. So I strongly suggest that you bring this out for your next party. Now, one of the cool things about punch, first of all, punches reigned supreme in the 19th century. There are a dozen references to punch in the Doten diaries. And he would just mention, and a punch was served, or we had a cold punch, or a hot punch. And I believe a hot toddy is actually related to some of the hot punches, which I'll talk about a little bit. And what's really interesting is, according to the book, it suggests that when making a punch, the water that you add should be steeped in tea, in black tea. And so it should be tea water. I find that very interesting. And if you look at this recipe, which is rum, brandy, sugar, lemons, boiling tea water, and a bit of nutmeg, and then it's sat overnight, I imagine that that tea would kind of give it a bit of an earthiness, would kind of cut through some of the syrupiness of the rum and the brandy. There is some very interesting, I really want to try this. I was unable to demo this, mostly because of the lockdown. I think my wife and I would die trying to put away 15 portions of this punch by ourselves. But if you look at the instructions, there's some kind of fun little aspects. I love one of the last sentences on the left. Allow a quart for 4 persons, but this information must be taken cum grano salis, a grain of salt, for the capacities of persons for this kind of beverage are genuinely supposed to vary considerably. So it's warning you not to knock your patron socks off. And then there's also a fun little note on the right. Irish whiskey is not fit to drink until it is 3 years old. The best whiskey for this purpose is Kinahan's LL whiskey. This book is also available online in its entirety, and I encourage you to kind of peruse it. There's some fun little things in here. And the cold whiskey punch is the hot brandy or rum punch, but you add in whiskey. And on the next page is the modern recipe. So I'm going to leave that up for a minute, but do we have any questions?
Yes, there is one. In the question in the chat, there's a question. What's the origin of the word toddy?
Toddy. That's a very good question, and I actually don't have an answer for you. If you'll give me 2 seconds, I have a great. I'll just quickly look up the etymology. I know that's not very, very satisfying, but that is a question I've had myself. Actually, I'm not entirely sure. If you want to send me an email, I'll do some research and get back to you.
Would you want to put your email in the messages?
Yes.
In the chat? Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing,
okay,
because this recipe is once again available on the Carson City website.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm going to change my view for everybody so I can see hands and things. Well, maybe. Oh, wait a sec. There we go. So does anybody have any other questions? Oh, Toddy was an actress, someone says. Oh, and here's Garrett's email address, gbarmore@unr.edu. How original.
Yes.
Okay.
You can, if you know someone's name, you can generally guess their UNR email.
For those of you who are familiar with Ron James, who was with the State Historical Preservation Office or whatever, SHPO, I love his address. It's ron@unr.edu. Yeah.
It looks like, does Jennifer Kent have a question?
Um, it's,
Yeah. Hey, Garrett, Shane, big fan. I had a question about you. Looks like you came across a lot of records of multiple breweries in Virginia City. Did in your research find anything about anything actually being distilled in
So,
this town?
so in the course of my research, I didn't really come across any distilleries, but one of the first business licenses in the United States was issued to a distillery out towards Elko. Um, but there were distilleries in Nevada. I don't know how many of them were legal, mostly because I think that beer was a little less regulated at that time. But like I said, this is an ongoing project, and I intend to continue researching. So hopefully we can do this again, and I'll have an entirely new presentation for you guys.
that sounds great. By the way, in the chat, Julia says that Toddy was an actress, and then she says later, Thelma Alice Todd. So maybe that's where that came from. Because things
Maybe I will make sure to do some research because I did kind of quickly look it up here and there, and there's just not really a great satisfying answer with a quick search. So I will try to actually look into that. And Toddy is used a lot in that book. There's a lot of different kinds of toddies.
I guess if there can be a margarita, there can be a toddy, I guess. Were there any drinks served on the V&T Railroad?
So once again, I don't know. That was a little bit outside of my scope. I was mostly focusing more on kind of Virginia City in that area. And that's something I definitely will look into.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion.
Okay, and Professor, it says here that maybe, I'm assuming it's the word toddy they're referring to. It may also be from the Hindi word taddy from palm sap, and then came here from the British. We can always blame things on the British, I guess.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And,
okay. And then there's a question here, or let's see, found etymology. This is from Dennis Little, says, the word toddy comes from the toddy drink in India, produced by fermenting the sap of palm trees. Its earliest known use to mean a beverage made of alcoholic liquor with hot water, sugar, and spices is from 1786. And somebody else is, Noel is coming up with pretty much the same type of reference too.
Well, thank you guys.
By the way, I want to make a slight correction. I think it's a correction. I've seen that mouthpiece. I don't think it's a trombone mouthpiece.
Okay.
I think it's more from an E flat horn. But
okay.
I think I mentioned it one time to Bob Nyland, but I'm not going to get in an argument with Bob Nyland about the origins of anything. But he's looking right at me. I can tell in my screen. See, any other questions? There might be. Oh, wait, maybe there are some.
I had a question. I'm just curious, and this is probably going to be based on your own, opinion, conjecture, but what do you think like the home bar and like drinking within the home looked like? Like you have that one letter where he went home and obviously made himself a hot toddy. But it's much harder to find out about that than the public record of bars. What do you think home bars looked like?
So once again, this is conjecture, but it probably was a lot more single liquors, maybe not a lot of mixing. And a hot toddy, if you remember the actual recipe, it was a lot simpler. Historically, it would have just been sugar, water, and brandy. So probably would have, boiled some water on the stove and may have had some fresh fruit, like a lemon or an orange, but not necessarily. And so home bars at that time would have been pretty much what they had, and of course would have been related to class and what they could afford. But they probably weren't making a lot of cocktails at home.
Did they have, they had some of the Chinese working up in Virginia City, right? So did they have their own drinks. I noticed they've listed not the dark tea, but the green tea was
Mhm.
there.
So the Chinese in Virginia City were fairly regulated Chinatown. They were not allowed to mine. And so, and there's not a lot of records on a lot of the details, mostly because they weren't kept. And one of the reasons why the Chinese worked in industries such as laundries or restaurants is because those were the jobs that they were allowed to have, that they could get. In fact, one of the oldest buildings in Virginia City, right across from the courthouse, is a former Chinese laundry. Yeah.
There's someone here, Bob Q says, great talk. You mentioned an African-American saloon. Any more to share on that? Was it out of necessity where the African-Americans were not permitted in other Virginia City saloons? Or were they all welcome in any saloons?
So it's not entirely clear, but there was a lot of saloons. A lot of saloons ended up kind of focused around culture. There was the Irish saloons. There was the African-American saloons. There were German saloons. In fact, where St. Mary's Art Center is now, that was a German beer garden originally, before it was leveled to build the hospital. So there definitely was, racism was rampant and predominant in Virginia City, like it was in any 19th century city. And African Americans also weren't allowed to mine. John Mackey had voted to not segregate the mines. However, the miners union voted to not allow miners in, and you had to be part of the union, or not to allow African Americans in. You had to be part of the union in order to mine. So there wasn't, and you see this a lot throughout Nevada history, about how there wasn't segregation on the books, but there was workarounds. So there was still exclusion.
Okay, I think we have the questions. I think there's you can unmute if you want to applaud. We could do that. Why don't we just do that? Here we go. Here we go.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So quickly, I just want to mention that we have some future events. Karen Dustman on March 18th will be doing her talk on the lessons from the cemetery, about the Genoa Cemetery. And then I'll see if I can get something for April, the third Thursday in April, April 15th, tax day. And then my friend Bruce Roeder, May 20th, is going to talk about the Museum of Political Corruption, which is in Albany, New York. And he's going to stay up late so he can do that lecture for us. So, I see Chris's name, Chris Baer's name, and he's offered to do a lecture too. So we'll take a look into that. My goal is to have lectures 10 out of the 12 months this year. And maybe some of them will actually be in person. We've got Wi-Fi now at the Historical Society Carriage House, and we may be able to do live streaming from there. I will be posting the lectures. I will be posting this lecture on YouTube in a few days. Takes a little while for me to edit out my bad comments. And I probably will send some questionnaires to you to see how you like this. I've got your email addresses. And don't be surprised if there is a membership form that comes along with it, because we would love to have you as members of the Historical Society. It starts at just $25. But if you want to give, I think we have a category of $250 or less. And so that's all for now. Thank you very much, Garrett. And
Yeah, no problem. And I can stick around for a few minutes if people have any more questions.
Okay, I'll just leave it up, and then people can unmute, and if we get problems, then we've got problems. But we've got the important parts in. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, I got some more for you, Garrett, if you're gonna be hanging around for a minute. Um, and this might be more of a Virginia City history question, but uh, what was like the currency exchange for goods? Was it, I mean, were they using paper currency? Were they using gold flecks, or what were they paying for their cocktails with?
That's a very good question. It's actually something that I was going to include, and then it just kind of got forgotten. Is going back to that cash book. There's a really cool entry where it talks about using greenbacks, and they made a note that they half the value. So if something cost 50 cents, you could use a $1 greenback for it. And it was just because paper money wasn't trusted, but it was legal tender. But since it was the frontier, there was a lot more, and I really don't know the history of. I think that by the 1860s and 70s, there was more consistent currency out here. But I know that when you look at the early 19th century back east, every different states had different currency, different banks had different paper money, and so you might have $100 in script, and then the next day it's worthless. And so there was a big distrust of paper money in the 19th century. There wasn't really a lot, as far as I have come across, there wasn't really a lot of using mineral as currency, mostly because this wasn't like the California gold fields where you would actually have gold dust or gold nuggets. They were mining silver, and also the silver that they were mining needed to be heavily processed in order to get to the mineral. So it was in ore, in the rock, and miners were paid regularly. So they most likely, the most common currency you would probably see would be federal coins, and then some greenbacks. And Bob might know better than I do, but.
Well, on that question, I've noticed in doing research on food, it would give a discount if you paid in coin, silver coin, versus the greenbacks.
And it's also worth noticing that mentioning that the debate about whether or not to go to the gold or silver standard of the late 19th century, meaning are we going to back up our currency with gold or with silver, which was a major debate throughout the 19th century. Essentially, the decision to move to the gold standard is what killed mining in Virginia City. Is it devalued silver overnight? And it wasn't because they ran out of silver. If you go up there and you do some of the underground mine tours, like the Collar Mine, there's still a lot of silver sulfide up there.
And a lot of the early mining methods were not very efficient. So they would, matter of fact, there would be, there were about 25 mines that were along the Carson River, and some that were up, not mines, excuse me, mills. And they would be gathering carloads of, railroad carloads of the dirt or the soil or whatever, and they'd be processing it, and then they would only take the easy stuff at first, and then people would go back later, and there were special groups that would actually mine the tailings, and there are even some people who tried to do the Carson River, because there was a lot of coin, a lot of good metal that was still in there, but that wasn't as efficient as they thought it would be.
And reworking tailings, something that the mining industry still does, and also determining exactly what or how rich or what will be milled is one way that Sharon manipulated the mills and determined which mills would succeed. And that's oversimplifying it. There is a lot, but there is a lot of really interesting stuff that went behind the scenes with how mills were operated. Yeah. And ultimately, whoever could get the ore to which mill controlled the Comstock.
And there's also a lot of debate about how much gold and silver was actually taken out of the Comstock, because the mills were actually doing a little bit of skimming. And there's some stories about the bullion exchange that they put into the Carson mint after it closed as a U.S. mint, and some of the mill operators, they think that maybe 20% was never accounted for.
Well, the Keck Museum has the receipts. If you want to come see some milling receipts, we have them.
The on the books ones or the off the book ones?
That's the question, right?
Right. Talk about the Piper. It was one of the Piper brothers was caught in a pretty important scheme. It was even mentioned in the papers back east about him taking some of the amalgam, I think it was called, and taking it out in his lunchbox, over days, and and he had to pay a fine. Two others didn't get it so easy. They had spent 8 years in jail.
There could be a whole lecture just on the scandals and the schemes of Virginia City.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any more questions or anything? I mean, David and I will ramble on together for. Oh.
Okay. I think I see happy faces. It's not like, so it's not like maybe they tried out those drinks while you were talking. I don't know.
Who were the four main families that you had talked about for Virginia City? You had said McKay and O'Brien, and who were the other two?
So they weren't really families. They were businessmen, and they formed what was called the Bonanza Firm. And it was O'Brien, let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head. O'Brien Mackey are the two famous, Fair and Flood. And they really, so in the early days of Virginia City, it was mostly controlled by what was called the bank crowd. And Sharon was the representative on the ground and really kind of pulled the strings. And the bank crowd was in reference to the Bank of California, which owned most of the operations, and they had a monopoly. And they would do things like buy a mine, become shareholder, or they would buy the mine, give them a lease, so the bank would own the mine. Then they would install themselves as the director of the mine or the mill, run it in the ground, so it had to close. Then the bank would receive all of its assets. Then they would reopen it and operate it at a gain. And so when Mackey, Fair, O'Brien, and Flood arrived on the scene, they were able to pool their resources. Flood and Mackey were old miners who worked their way up, started as muckers, and they arrived in the early 1860s. And O'Brien and Fair were stockbrokers essentially, and owned some financial institutions in San Francisco. So they were able to combine their resources, buy up some mines, struck some pretty heavy bonanzas, including the Con Virginia, and eventually pushed the Bank of California out of Virginia City, founded the Bank of Nevada, which actually went on to eventually become what we now call Wells Fargo. And so that's what I was in reference to. Their company was called the Bonanza Firm. They were also known as the Bonanza Crowd, the Big Four, or by their enemies, the Irish Four, which was considered an insult. So I hope that answers your question.
I think we're ready to go try out the recipes or something.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much, guys. If you have any more questions or anything, you have my email, and I'd also be more. I would love to hear how your cocktails go.
Okay. One last reminder: if you're not a member, well, even if you are a member, or even if you aren't a member, if you want to check what we're doing, take a look at CC Historical and .org. Sorry, cchistorical.org. And Sue, you want to talk about just quickly talk about what's coming up with the ladies of Carson Valley, or hold on, I'll unmute. I need to unmute you, or you need to unmute you.
I got it.
Yeah.
They're doing an exhibit of women of Eagle Valley, notable women of Eagle Valley, and there are about 8 or 9. It's complete with art exhibits that local artists have done with telling a story about what these women have accomplished in Carson and Eagle Valley. It's wonderful. Kat Long is putting it together, and we keep hoping that it's going to be clear enough to open the carriage house and show people. So keep an eye out. We're hoping for March 20th for a soft opening, and then we hope to see all of you there. Some of the women are like Teresa Laxalt and the Lampas and Agnes Train, and just people that you don't normally hear about. For instance, Clara Chrysler, who created the Nevada state flag, the second Nevada state flag, because she thought the other one was boring. So it'll be a lot of fun, and I hope to see you there.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I have the power to end this conversation right now because these goodbyes go on so long. So in the drama way, here, the end. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Bye.